Hello, everyone. My name is John Luskey. I'm the Director of Education, at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, and I'm thrilled today to be joined by Dr. Ashley Luskey, who works up at Gettysburg College at the Civil War Institute. Thanks for being with us, Ashley.
Yeah, thanks for having me, John. It's always nice to chat with you, and certainly nice to be back with you.
Absolutely. And back by popular demand, we did, oh gosh, a couple years ago now, we did a video looking at the civilian impact of Civil War battle, specifically by focusing on some of the farmsteads, the farm families on the Gettysburg battlefield and how they recovered from the battle, how the 3 days impacted them. And that's one of the things we really like to emphasize here at the museum, that a Civil War battle is more than just the 1, 2, or 3 days that it happens. The impact of that goes for months and oftentimes years beyond when the battle actually took place. We obviously highlight that story at one of our locations, the Pry House Field Hospital Museum, because that was the Pry family property. But having a field hospital on your property and crops taken and such, I mean, it can be very devastating, as I'm sure we'll get into today. Quickly, before we jump into our topic today, just want to say, of course, thank you for tuning in. We wouldn't be here doing what we do without everyone tuning in and watching, so we appreciate that. And if you want to follow us and stay up to date and support us, consider liking the video, sharing the video, sending it to someone you think would enjoy it, following us across all our social medias, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and now TikTok more recently. So we're everywhere. And of course, follow the Civil War Institute at Gettysburg College. They do all kinds of great digital programming as well. So that's an easy, free way to support both our organizations. And if you want to take your support to the next level, consider becoming a member of the museum. For as low as $25 a year, you get free admission to 4 different locations, our 3 sites, as well as the Seminary Ridge Museum in Gettysburg. We have a reciprocal membership program with them, and then discounts in the gift shop, and you get the warm, fuzzy feeling knowing that your membership dollars are supporting programming like this and the type of work that we do here at the museum. So really appreciate it if you have the money to spare to support us in that way. So with that said, Ashley, let's, well, before we start, maybe you could remind folks a little bit about, who you are and how you came to Civil War history. And then specifically, maybe I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what drew you to the research of the families in the Gettysburg area.
Sure. So as John said, I work at the Civil War Institute at Gettysburg College, which is an office that does both programming for students. We facilitate a number of internships at public history sites and national park sites across the country every year. I also work closely with students there on individual digital history projects, on interpretive projects. We do field experiences out in the battlefield. We do discussions with various public historians about aspects of the career field of public history. And so we're very much an academic office, but we're also very much a public-facing office. John knows from personal experience that we run a fairly large conference every June that attracts around 300 or so people each year. It's about a 6-day long conference, and we bring in leading scholars, Civil War historians, public historians from all over. And we meet for 6 days, and we have a number of lectures, we have battlefield tours, we have very intense kind of active track battlefield tours now for those who want a hiking intensive experience, as well as some that are a little bit more relaxed. We have kind of more intimate small group discussions between the faculty and the attendees. And so the conference is very much a central point of what we do at CWI, and certainly a central point of what I do in helping to coordinate that conference every year. So I kind of wear a bunch of hats at CWI with my public history background, but also my academic training.
And quickly, I'll jump in with an unprompted testimonial. I mean, the conference is really delightful. Every year I've been going for, oh Lord, probably about 10 years now.
Yeah.
And it's fantastic. It's all typically in June. And correct me if I'm wrong, Ashley, for the 2023 summer conference, I believe if you're a first-time attendee, if you've never been, there's a pretty sweet deal. Am I correct in that?
So yes, partially. If you are a returning attendee and you bring someone who has never come before, you will get 50% off your CWI registration fee, which indeed is a pretty sweet deal. So if you have come to CWI and you want to recruit someone to come this year, that will get you a 50% discount. And we also have a number of other discounts as well. And in fact, a partnership with the National Museum of Civil War Medicine that we just got underway, kind of a reciprocal member benefit that you get 15% off your CWI registration if you're a member of the medical museum. So, but yes, John has been a loyal supporter of us for many years. And yeah, thank you for the testimonial, John.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a blast. And right, thank you for reminding me about the discount for our members. So they have all kinds of discounts. They've got discounts for public historians. I know some of our regular viewers who I just met at our conference recently work at Bentonville Battlefield, and that would apply to folks like them. There's all kinds of discounts. So the scholarships for high school students and teachers and things. So that there's all kinds of ways to get discounts or pay full price because you want to support a great organization. So anyway, it's a great conference.
And I will add too, as part of our reciprocal partnership with the Civil War Medical Museum, if you do come to CWI this year, the Medical Museum will give you 15% off your admission to the museum. So it's kind of a bundled registration. Again, trying to support like-minded institutions and promote history education as much as we can now that things are mostly back in person, which is great.
Yeah, we're all on the same team, and it's it's fun to be able to do things like that. So yeah, thanks for giving the pitch about the conference. But tell us about a bit about your background in Civil War history, and then what drew you to the farmsteads of Gettysburg.
Sure. So I have been doing Civil War history for many years. I have a master's in history with a concentration in public history, as well as a PhD in American history with a concentration in 19th century American history. And I've worked at several Civil War sites for the National Park Service, including 8 years at Richmond National Battlefield Park in Richmond, Virginia, where I interpreted multiple battles and also the home front experience of Richmonders during the Civil War. I also have done internships at various sites, including Gettysburg, various digital history projects pertaining to the Civil War. So kind of a long relationship with Civil War history that started actually with a very early, maybe when I was 7 years old or so, interest in colonial history, just from growing up in Massachusetts, just outside Boston, in a colonial farmhouse, and getting into history from a very young age. And like many people, we took a trip to Gettysburg when I was very little. And that was kind of the turning point for me. My conversion process into the Civil War had begun. And from then on out, I knew that I wanted to do something with Civil War history and preferably with public history, with the Park Service, and just being on the actual sites where the fighting took place and where these people lived during the war. And a central part of my interest in the Civil War is in fact the civilian experience. That's what my dissertation was on, and what my current book manuscript is on, is about Confederate women in Richmond, Virginia, and how they navigated kind of the social politics of the social upheaval going on there in the city during the war. But in terms of Gettysburg, I guess I always wondered, again, coming here since I was very little, seeing all of these farmsteads, seeing all of the houses in town, some of them pockmarked with bullets and other battle damage. And I always wondered, gosh, what would it have been like to be here during the battle? What decisions would I have made? Would I have chosen to flee? Would I have chosen to hide out in my basement? Would something horrible have happened to myself or to my family? And as I kind of grew older and started thinking about the variances in these people's experiences, I definitely realized that there was no one civilian experience, of course, during the Battle of Gettysburg. In fact, the experiences were vastly different, and the outcomes for these people were vastly different. And kind of delving into just the complexity and the variances that these individuals, experienced before the battle came, during the battle, and then afterwards. John, as you said, in the days, weeks, months, and years to come, the stories were so diverse. Sometimes very much at odds with each other. There were some people who actually made out pretty well after the battle, whether they took up some kind of entrepreneurial business related to the battle and battle tourism, whether they were able to purchase the land of others who had no choice but to leave after the devastation. Some of them did remarkably well for themselves. Of course, we know that for others, it did not turn out so well. And in fact, sometimes the stories are devastating. And then there was kind of a class of people in between, who managed to survive. They managed to rebuild and pick up the pieces. Their lives were never the same, but it was kind of a mixed bag of results for them. And so it's really that variance, and the complexity of the fabric of the civilian experience that kind of drove me to want to understand those experiences more.
And there's certainly a host of those stories as it relates to the Gettysburg area. I wonder if we could start with someone, a story that I just recently became aware of, that of Mag Palm, and just what a remarkable experience she had. Could you maybe kind of get us started there, please?
Yeah, so whenever we talk about the civilian experience in Gettysburg, one of the things that makes it so unique is the fact that here we are just a few miles from the Mason-Dixon line. There was always a tenuous existence for a lot of people in Gettysburg, a sense of liminality during the war, that at any time they could be attacked by Confederates. And yet there are also a lot of social crossovers, economic crossovers between Northerners who lived in Gettysburg, who had families who lived in the South, who lived in Maryland or Virginia, who relied on commerce that happened over the border in the South. And so there was this kind of uneasy relationship with the South that grew even more uneasy over the course of the war as fears of Confederate raids and certainly battles came to the forefront of people's minds. But for a certain group of individuals, namely Gettysburg's African-American residents, that sense of liminality, that tenuous existence, was that much more exaggerated. And this was the case for Mag Palm. Mag Palm, and I'll actually share my screen and share an image of her. That's not the one. Shared the wrong thing. There you go. This is Mag Palm. She was a Black woman living in Gettysburg during the time of the battle. She would be 32 in 1863 by the time the war comes to her doorstep. She was one of about 200 Black residents of Gettysburg at this time. And she, like most of the other Black residents, constantly lived in fear of kidnappings that would occur even before the war, but also during the war itself, where slaveholders or slave catchers would come across the border and they would try to either re-enslave African Americans who had escaped slavery or take freeborn African Americans into slavery. And this was a regular occurrence in Adams County, Gettysburg, the broader South Central Pennsylvania area. And Mag Palm herself lived in constant fear of this, and in fact was the victim of such an attempted kidnapping in 1858 when she was returning back from work on Baltimore Street, and she was coming back to her home on Long Lane, which, if those of you out there know Gettysburg, Long Lane is directly adjacent to the fields where Pickett's charge took place. In fact, it runs kind of right near where General Pickett's buffet stands today. She was in that vicinity, and a couple of white men approached her. It was in the nighttime, and they tried to kidnap her and take her over the border into the South and sell her into slavery. Now, Mag Palm was a pretty feisty woman. She was always known for carrying some kind of weapon on her, a pistol or a knife, to defend herself. She was very outspoken about early civil rights for Black people. She would try and help escape slaves through the Underground Railroad network that was very active in this area. So she had a target on her back. But anyway, these men try and kidnap her, and she is alone and she tries to fight them off. She can't. And as the story goes, she supposedly resorted to biting the thumb off of one of the attempted kidnappers. Her screaming led to other residents in the area hearing her, and one man in particular ran out. He found her being attacked and helped to drive off the attackers. So Magpom herself obviously was subjected to the terror of living on the border of North and South even before the war erupted. And one of the other things for Gettysburg's Black residents was that they not only couldn't trust who might be coming over the border from the South, but they also had difficulty trusting their own residents, other white residents of Gettysburg, because one of the kidnappers of Magpom was none other than Philip Snyder, who lived in Gettysburg at the base of what is now known as Big Round Top. So he was a man who lived not that far from where Magpom lived. And he was one of the individuals who tried to kidnap her into slavery. So her experience with the kidnapping certainly shows the liminal existence and kind of the terror that Black residents constantly faced. And certainly during the Gettysburg campaign, there were rumors that the Confederates had been in Pennsylvania all throughout 1862, again into 63. And of course, the Confederates do come in 63 and then come back in 64 up to Chambersburg, which is near Gettysburg. And there were kidnappings. And so when they hear that the Confederates are approaching, a lot of these African Americans flee. They flee to places like Lancaster or Philadelphia, places where they knew that there were networks that they could get to safely. One of the interesting things about Magpom is that, as scrappy of an individual as she was, her existence also showcased the hardscrabble life that a lot of Black residents of Gettysburg led simply by the nature of their race, but also their class. Magpom was not wealthy by any means. She was a tenant who lived on the farm of Abraham Bryan, which, again, those of you who know Gettysburg, Abraham Bryan was a Black man who owned about 12 acres of land and a white house and white barn on Cemetery Ridge, just on kind of the edge of where Pickett's charge occurred. And she was married, or at least considered married by some people, to another Black man named Alfred, although according to the 1860 census, she was listed as a harlot as her occupation because they weren't officially married. They were just living together for an extended period of time. They had a young son, and they did their best at kind of menial domestic work. Mag worked downtown in Baltimore Street near the area of the square. She worked for wealthy whites down there. She also worked at the train station carrying baggage. Alfred was a brickmaker and a barber. He kind of switched back and forth with his professions. But their lifestyle was kind of hard scrabble. And the more and more I looked into her story, hearing about the famed attempted kidnapping, the biting off of the thumb, was that I realized that her existence was, there was a lot more to it than those kind of grandiose legends that we had heard about. And I found that both she and Alfred had been arrested and indicted numerous times, both before the war and during the war, for beating up other Black people in town, for beating up white individuals, for larceny. Magpom actually stole from one of the individuals she worked for on Baltimore Street. I also found that Alfred was indicted numerous times for beating up Magpom, and Magpom brought Alfred to court numerous times for various domestic offenses. And so what this all highlights is that as much as Magpom was trying her best to work multiple jobs, and she was very active in the Underground Railroad and the Slave Refuge Society and all of that, trying to help uplift the Black community, there was no one monolithic Black community in Gettysburg. They were divided by class. Certainly, Magpom was doing what she could to try and survive. And sometimes all that she could do was maybe not exactly within the confines of the law. And she was also subject to this domestic abuse from Alfred, her so-called husband. So numerous times in the Gettysburg newspaper, you see her name come up, you see Alfred's name come up, bringing each other to court, being brought into court for various other offenses, again, just trying to survive amidst a hardscrabble existence. Now, flash forward to the battle itself. Mag and Alfred, they do flee. We think they might have fled to Lancaster with a bunch of the other Black Gettysburgians. She does come back, and she comes back to Abraham Bryan's farm, where she continues being a tenant. And in fact, she stays on at the farm even after Abraham Bryan himself moves into town and later passes away. Now, for Mag Palm, the domestic work continues, because that is the way for her to continue supporting herself and her children. But also the domestic abuse continues from Alfred. And in fact, in 1879, I believe, the Gettysburg newspaper reported that Mag attempted to drown herself and her 8-year-old son in a pond located near Long Lane. And again, because Mag had been so well known in the community for being this, brave defender, for, the thumb biting incident, but also for some of the more illicit things that she was involved in, this drew a lot of attention, and people started wondering, okay, what's wrong with Mag Palm? And there was speculation that she was in poor health. It was found out that she was nearly blind by this point. So she wasn't doing physically well, and obviously the emotional toll of everything she had been through, the hardscrabble existence, the domestic abuse, the battle, rebuilding in the aftermath of that, had obviously, built and taken its toll on her. The interesting thing is that she and Alfred do go on to officially get married sometime between 1870 and 1880. We're not exactly sure, but it appears that the domestic abuse continues, and eventually Mag Palm has saved up enough money for herself that she purchases her own land parcel on Washington Street in what is historically and still is the 3rd Ward of Gettysburg. And so she is able to move out. She lives with her son and her daughter on Washington Street. There's no record that Alfred ever moved with her. And in fact, Alfred will die at the almshouse in, I believe, 1903. So they do separate at some period of time. And you might wonder, okay, how did she achieve the economic independence to be able to do this, to be able to strike out on her own and support her 2 kids? Certainly, she continues her domestic work. She's working very hard after the war, but she also participates in a series of fundraisers, one of which was widely celebrated in the Gettysburg newspaper, November of 1891, where there was a community fundraiser for various groups in Gettysburg, and she promoted herself as that she was going to be there. She was going to be the star of this fundraiser, and she was going to perform and retell the narrative of her attempted kidnapping. And if you paid a certain amount of money, you could come and you could hear her retell the story. And of course, how does she get people to come? It's not only the lure of this local legend, but it's also she teams up with some quote unquote white lady friends who agree to sell oysters at the fundraiser as well. So clearly she has cross ties, cross connections with white people in the town, as well as the Black community. And people turn out for this. And Mag Palm is a star. And in fact, this next image showcases Mag Palm showing people how her kidnappers attempted to tie her hands during that 1858 incident. And it's interesting that Mag Palm, despite her hardscrabble existence, she uses the story of her attempted kidnapping, this attempt to enslave her and take away her humanity, to help her survive financially after the war. So she's a very creative person for sure. She has to be. She has to overcome immense amount of turmoil and strife in her life, and it obviously takes a toll on her. She dies when she's only 65, and she's buried in the Lincoln Cemetery, which is the all-Black cemetery located in Gettysburg. But she leaves an interesting legacy in Gettysburg. People, of course, if they know of her, they probably know of the attempted kidnapping. They probably focus on, the biting off of the thumb and, what kind of, woman would do that, and just kind of this fascinating story. But there's so much more to Magpom than that story. She's obviously a freedom fighter. She obviously is a staunch protector of Black, civil rights in the community. She obviously helps to warn Black Gettysburgians when the Confederates are indeed invading in 1863. But on the other hand, she has her own share of run-ins with other Black members of the Gettysburg population, as well as with white residents as well. So it lends complexity to the story. Again, reminds you that no community is monolithic, and that there are numerous struggles that are going on for Black individuals as well as white individuals long before the war and long after.
Yeah, hers is such an amazing story, and what I love about the research that you've done on this is, you know, she gets to be a 3D kind of character.
Yeah.
There are just a lot of different sides to her story, just as you were saying there, and it's certainly the African American story in the Civil War era has um, largely been neglected throughout certainly much of the 20th century. I mean, it's been a pleasure to be a part of some of the reclaiming of that in the 21st or yeah, the 21st century. And this is just an amazing story that hasn't, had as much light shown on. I just learned of this recently, actually at the most recent CWI conference. So it's a pleasure to be able to share this here on this channel. And yeah, just a remarkable one, and one that sheds light on just the challenge of not being especially wealthy in 19th century America, and certainly being an African American person right on the border between slavery and freedom. And it's a great example of how something like the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, how it there are specific ramifications that it leads to consequences for individuals, especially those right on the border. And yeah, just her story is illustrative of so many things, and she certainly led a remarkable and challenging life for sure.
Right, right. I know, and I think that's another thing when people say, the Northern civilian experience or the Southern civilian experience. There is no one experience, even within one single town. In Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, there are so many experiences. There is no one Black Gettysburg experience. There are just, certainly you can have commonalities, and there can be trends and patterns. I'm not saying that we have to splice everything up into the individual level, but her story showcases so much of the different fabric that comprises these communities and these quote unquote experiences that form the overall picture of what life was like. And certainly, yeah, you can't stress enough the liminality and the tenuousness of living on the border of slavery and freedom, and just how much of a different experience that is for Black residents of Gettysburg and the greater Gettysburg area.
Absolutely. And that's such a great point about the, benefits and challenges of breaking things down to the individual level. There's a lot that can be gained for, in terms of historical analysis by looking at larger groups of folks, but there is definitely something you lose by kind of grouping folks together in that way. And that is kind of the remarkable texture of stories like this.
Sure.
Um, so there will always be power in individual stories, and this
Absolutely.
is certainly a really good one.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's pivot now to another individual story. Let's talk about the Harmons,
Yeah.
who also lived in Gettysburg, and what their experience was.
Sure. So the Harmons had quite a different experience from Magpom. The Harmons, namely Emmanuel Harmon, owned a large tract of about 124 acres just west of Gettysburg, just across from Willoughby Run, where some of the most intense fighting of the entire battle, in fact, happened, was across Willoughby Run and in McPherson's Woods, just behind where the Harmons lived. But he was very wealthy, Emmanuel Harmon, and he acquired this property and then immediately rented it out to tenants, or took on tenants, at least two tenants that we know of. And Emmanuel Harmon went into Washington, D.C. to another residence and continued living in Washington, D.C. shortly after he acquired this property in 1857. He was something of an inventor, I guess you could say. He had numerous patents that he was working on. He obviously had the money to finance these various, enterprises that he was working on. And so when the battle arrives on the morning of July 1st, 1863, there are just two individuals at home on the Harmon property. Amelia Harmon, who is a 16-year-old girl, we think it might have been Emmanuel's niece, as well as Amelia's aunt named Rachel. And a lot of people, whenever I tell the story, say July 1st, 1863, there were obviously rumors that the Confederates were in the area. Where did all the men go? A good story, a good point for sure. It just so happened that the male tenants, hearing that the Confederates were in the area, gathered up as many of the horses as they could, and they drove them away. They took them to a place on South Mountain where they thought that they would be safer, because Confederates, of course, were known for taking any supplies that they could to resupply their own army, and certainly they'd be interested in taking horses and other livestock. So anyway, it's just Amelia and her aunt Rachel at home on the morning of July 1st. And as I said, the first shots of the Battle of Gettysburg happened not far from where the Harmon farm is. They're about a mile, maybe a mile and a half max to the west of where the Harmons live. And so that morning they hear the opening shots, the two ladies do, and they're intensely curious. They don't flee right away. They in fact go right to the window to try and see what's happening. And pretty soon they begin to see Union cavalry racing across their property. Then they see Confederate infantry coming across the property, taking shots at the Union cavalry. And they realize, okay, maybe the first floor of the house by the window is not the safest place to be. Now, again, thinking about choices and what I might have done, I would probably have headed to the basement, which was the safest place in the house. But again, Amelia and her aunt are intensely curious about this experience. And they end up going to the second floor of their house. And they're looking out the window, watching the fighting. It's becoming more and more intense, swirling around their outbuildings, their farm buildings. And all of a sudden, a mini ball crashes through the shutter right next to Rachel's ear. And they kind of look at each other and they wonder, maybe now is the time to get out. Just then, a Union cavalryman shouts up to them and says, you better get down in the basement or get out, because this is kind of your last warning. They agree to leave the window, but they end up going to the cupola of the house, so one story higher. Maybe they thought they were safe up there. They were well above where musketry and certainly low range artillery shells would be hitting. And again, they were just so curious. This was a once in a lifetime experience, and probably it was very surreal to be there, not really fully contemplating their own mortality in that moment. Eventually they realize, okay, they're not safe up in the cupola. The intensity of the fighting has, picked up. And so they end up going to the basement. And Amelia leaves this great account, firsthand account of what it was like to be in the basement in particular. And she complains that, up in the cupola, you could see everything that was going on. You could tell who was winning, who was taking control of the farm. You could count the number of, bodies on the ground. But in the basement, she had no idea what was happening. And being in that darkness and in that chaos, that confusion, that's so kind of a microcosm of what so many Gettysburg residents experience. We think, they're right in the middle of it, so they have to know exactly what's going on, when in fact, it's the exact opposite. They don't know what's going on. They're swirling amidst the chaos. And it's really only those on the outside of things that have a better picture of what's going on.
Which
and
is,
Amelia,
I think, which is applicable for the soldiers who fight in the battle as well.
absolutely.
The details in soldiers' letters and diaries about the experience of any given Civil War battle are, certainly good and interesting to read. But if you're looking for some comprehensive, understanding of what all is happening, look elsewhere. So that's
Right.
that's a great point.
Right, right. And so Amelia, she does catch, there's a small window in the basement, and she does catch the sight of more and more gray pants running past the window. And she figures, okay, we're behind Confederate lines now. And she hears footsteps upstairs. She had bolted the door before they went into the basement, but the soldiers had burst into the house. There are footsteps, there's shooting going on from the windows out at the other Union soldiers. And pretty soon she hears the Confederate soldiers upstairs say that they're planning to set fire to the house. And again, people looking back at this from 21st century eyes might say, oh, this is total warfare. This is destroying civilian property in kind of a wanton fashion. But this is one of the rare cases in Gettysburg where a civilian home, was actively destroyed. Certainly there are houses caught in the crossfire, but this one had to be burned down essentially in Confederate eyes, because it was being used back and forth as a Union sharpshooter's nest. Every time the Union troops would take over the house and the fighting, they'd get inside, they'd use the windows as a place to fire at Confederates, and then vice versa, of course. So the Confederates agreed to protect themselves. They'd have to burn the house down. That way, no more Union soldiers could use it as a sharpshooter's nest. Amelia bursts through the door. She begs the soldiers not to set fire to the house. They say, no, it has to be done. And the last thing she sees is them piling up the books, the carpets, the clothing, and setting fire to the home. So she and her aunt obviously have to flee at this time. And as they're racing out the back door, they see that the barn is also engulfed in flames. But more terrifying is that they realize that they are between the battle lines. They are literally caught between the Confederate line advancing against the Union line. They begin to run as fast as they can. They eventually fall backwards behind Confederate lines, which is an even more terrifying moment. And Confederates are kind of looking at them like, what on earth are these women doing? Running in the middle of a battle. They eventually make it up close to where the seminary is, on Seminary Ridge. They run into a couple of Confederate officers as well as a journalist, and they tell their story, and the journalist helps them find shelter up on Seminary Ridge, which is where they stay until the fighting ends. And they don't return home to their property until July 5th. Now, when they come back, you can imagine the destruction. The house is kind of burned out. They're not completely destroyed. The barn is destroyed, the outbuildings, all kinds of personal, materials, clothing, farm implements, they're all gone. How do they pick up the pieces? You would think this has to be one of these tragic stories, right? They've lost so much. And, this is a tenant property. The landowner isn't even there at the time. Well, Emmanuel Harmon and his tenants, they do apply for or submit claims to have their losses reimbursed by the federal government. Not much is reimbursed because, as we know, the federal government only gives money back to individuals whose property was definitely destroyed or damaged by Union troops. It's impossible when your house is in the crossfires to know who did what, and if the Confederates were the ones who destroyed it, then you're not going to get any money, which is a common story. It doesn't really matter much to Emmanuel Harmon because he's wealthy enough that he can rebuild. And in fact, in 1864, he ends up purchasing some land adjacent to his farm that one of his neighbors couldn't afford to keep up anymore in the wake of the battle's damages. So he has now almost 200 acres to his name, which is a pretty significant farm. But even more interesting is that shortly after the war ends in 1865, there's a story that crops up in the local newspaper about a spring located on the Harmon property that had been known for 30 or 40 years to have certain mysterious properties to it, healing properties. And people who had written this article had said that even soldiers who fought there along Willoughby Run had drunk this water after they'd been wounded, and they were miraculously cured. Well, Emmanuel Harmon doesn't waste much time in jumping on this story. And by 1867, he has worked out a contract with a water bottling company based out of New York to bottle and market this water. And this company, which is called the Catalyson, I believe is how you pronounce it, Springs Company, they are selling water all over the country. Everyone wants this water. This has supposedly lithium in it, which is a healing salt. And they're selling this water, and Emmanuel Harmon is making out pretty good. Unfortunately, his fortunes are angering some of the people of Gettysburg because they realize that local Gettysburg resources are being used to make a bottling company from New York rich, and that those resources are being farmed out across the country and not to the community. So they say, well, the only good reason that you can keep this company, to Mr. Harmon, is to build a hotel that will attract tourists who will spend money in town, and then the town will get to benefit from this property as well. So eventually a contract is worked out, and the Gettysburg Springs Hotel opens in June of 1869. It is a massive structure, and I will share my screen again. It really reminds you of something from the grand hotels of New York and Philadelphia. 3 stories tall, and this building could host 250 guests. It had a large ballroom. It had eventually a bowling alley, all kinds of different amenities, and these guests got exclusive access to the water. The water would be used for drinking water from the springs, for bathing. People would come here to heal, to come to the countryside and get treated for whatever ailed them. And when the hotel opens in 1869, one of the very first guests is General George Meade himself, the commander of the Army of the Potomac. So the marketing for this hotel couldn't be any better. That they have the victor from the Battle of Gettysburg here as one of the first guests of this massive hotel. And for those of you who've been to Gettysburg, if you can imagine where this thing stood, if you know where the Gettysburg Day Spa currently is, just off Route 30, right adjacent to Willoughby Run, this was a massive structure that stood kind of just in the backyard, a little bit beyond the day spa. It's really hard for us to imagine these days. And again, this was opened, in 1869, which is a pretty amazing thing. So this hotel does pretty well for a while. It hosts a number of veterans for the various reunions that come back in the next couple of decades. But eventually, the veterans begin to die off. The business for the hotel starts to die off as well. And the hotel ends up kind of falling into disrepair. It only opens for special events, one being the 50th reunion in 1913, where a bunch of Gettysburg veterans came and stayed at the hotel. I'll show you, this is kind of what the complex looked like in its heyday. You can see there's a horse-drawn railway leading up across Willoughby Run to the hotel itself there in the background. Those of you who know Gettysburg, you've heard of Springs Avenue, which comes up over the Seminary Ridge. That was the original road from the horse-drawn railway to transport people coming from the train up to the Gettysburg Springs Hotel. So really, truly a massive, beautiful pastoral property. But again, by the 19-teens, it kind of loses its appeal. And unfortunately, a fire breaks out in 1917. And due to a recent snowstorm, the firefighters aren't able to arrive in time to put out the fire, and the building ends up burning to the ground. Now, Mr. Harmon, of course, is no longer alive by the time the Springs Hotel burns down, but he has certainly recouped his losses and then some from the battle by marketing this healing power of the spring, which of course has direct ties to the healing of Civil War soldiers who were wounded in his backyard. Eventually, this property, for those of you who have interest in it, gets turned into the Gettysburg Country Club. And this is where President Eisenhower used to play golf during his residence here in Gettysburg. And then most of it was sold to the Park Service in 2011. I should note that there is currently a proposition to construct 8 apartment buildings across part of this former battlefield and part of where this hotel complex was located on the Harmon farm. It doesn't look super positive in terms of having a good outcome for battlefield preservation, The apartment complex seems to be moving forward fairly steadily, although there are a number of us, including the Battlefield Trust, that are fighting that development. So we might very well be losing some of this incredibly historic property, part of the old Harmon farm, part of where the Catalyson Springs actually are located due to this new development that's going in, which is rather unfortunate. But if you can get out there before any development happens and enjoy, the beauty and the pastoral nature of what's out there, I'd highly recommend it. It's a fascinating story of the Harmons, obviously an entrepreneurial spirit that was able to benefit from the destruction and the horrible situations of the war. Having money, being wealthy before the war certainly helped, but certainly having a marketing spirit and a creativity certainly helped the Harmon family survive and, in fact, do very well for themselves after the battle.
What a remarkable story on multiple different levels. Just I can't fathom the experience of Rachel and Amelia, is that right?
Yeah,
I can't fathom that experience, the house being burned down, and suddenly you're just sort of out there,
right,
in between the lines, which is the last place you want to be on a Civil War battlefield,
right.
and just how jarring that must have been. And then um, the so that was news to me. I have heard the story of the hotel before, but it's outlandish
Yeah,
to recount.
yeah.
Um, wow, and man, imagine getting one of those original bottles of water. the,
I know. I know. I'd
the
love to know if there's any out there, any, glass
labels or
bottles that
something.
still have the imprint on it. That would be so neat to see, get your hands on.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's astonishing, and certainly the especially with the hotel and the bottling and such. That's at the opposite end of the spectrum from the Mag Palm story,
For
obviously.
sure. For sure.
Um, I wonder if maybe as we're kind of coming towards the end of our time, if you could sort of wrap us up with a story a little bit closer to your home turf, and talk about some of the Penn College students who were there at the time of the battle. Penn College, of course, being the predecessor to Gettysburg College. Yes, I wonder if you could maybe share some of those stories that you have.
Yeah, so these stories are interesting because it brings us down to yet another level of civilians who were here during the battle who didn't necessarily call Gettysburg their home. This was just where they happened to be going to school at the time of the battle. And although some students could travel home and were fairly local, there were many who could not, especially because the battle unfolded so quickly. Two of these students, Michael Culver and Horatio Watkins, who were more advanced students at the time, they were in class on the morning of July 1st when they heard those first shots ring out. And all of a sudden, a Union Signal Corps officer races into their classroom, demanding access to the cupola to get a view of the landscape. Obviously, the students are distracted, class is dismissed. They're basically told to try and find a place of safety. What's
Man, if you
interesting
if you
about
don't if you don't cancel class in anticipation of a Civil War battle, what do you cancel class for? Wow.
I know, I know. Well, I guess the teacher was pretty frustrated that no one would pay attention anymore, but I'm pretty sure that's asking just a little bit too much of college college students then or now. Um, I guess true to the nature of college students, these two individuals, they don't go running for cover. They actually go running out to the battlefield, which happened with a number of young, especially boys, but also some girls as well. And they wanted to catch a glimpse of the fighting. They end up going to the Lutheran Theological Seminary and climbing up to the cupola. I think well before John Buford made his legendary appearance up there. But they climb up to the cupola and they watch some of the opening shots of the battle. Um, they eventually a shell explodes past their heads and they decide maybe this isn't the smartest place to go. It's at that time that they get separated and their stories kind of diverge, so they come back together at the end of the fighting. Michael Culver ends up again going off to explore. He runs out to Cemetery Ridge to try and see what's going on out there. He sees troops arriving, hurrying past him to get to the first day's field. a chaplain kind of scolds him and says, basically, you better start helping out nursing some of the wounded or else get out of here. And Culver kind of shakes his head and agrees, okay, he should probably go and put himself to use. Horatio Watkins does the same thing. He's still out by the seminary. He eventually goes to the railroad depot and helps treat some soldiers from the Iron Brigade, mainly from the 24th Michigan, who had been fighting in McPherson's woods. But essentially what unfolds for the next couple of days with these two boys is them both seeking out news and active witnessing of the battle, with trying to lend a hand as much as possible to nursing wounds. Now, keep in mind that neither of these guys had any experience before the battle, like most civilians, in nursing gunshot wounds and, assisting with amputations and horrific things like that with trained soldiers. But this is what they find themselves doing. And in fact, Horatio Watkins is so dedicated to this job that a group of Union soldiers who's with him from the 12th Corps remark, and they call him the little doctor because he's spending so much time assisting them. What's also interesting about these two boys is that their experience is reflective of so many civilians during the battle, in terms of their lives are basically mobile units throughout the next few days. They are constantly moving from house to house to house. One house is deemed too dangerous. It's caught in the midst of the battle. They move to the next house. They find themselves there during dinner time. So the family cooks them dinner, takes them in. Then the next morning they move on. This is a common experience, families huddled in their basements, constantly accepting new crowds of families as they move in. Then the whole family and group vacating, going to someone else's house. Very much people were mobile units. They didn't just hunker down in their basements for 3 days. They were constantly on the move. And some of
Yeah,
the things that these guys,
that's such an interesting point, as I'm sure had to be the case for someone like Rachel and Amelia, who we spoke
yeah,
about earlier. And I'm certain that experience was fairly common in towns like Gettysburg, or I'm
yeah,
thinking the place like Fredericksburg,
sure,
places where Civil War battles happen kind of in and around the town. You know, your homes are taken over by wounded soldiers, and your life, in many ways ceases to happen at your home. It just happens wherever you are,
right,
and you're on the move. So that's the number of kind of itinerant people in these
yeah,
towns, by necessity, is not something I've ever really considered before. So thanks for
right,
bringing that to the forefront here.
right. And every home that they go to, every building that they go to, they find a new situation. They find wounded Union soldiers, they find wounded Confederate soldiers. At one point, one of them, I believe it's Horatio, is spending the evening in a house, and a Confederate soldier tries to beat down the door. They're terrified inside. It's a bunch of women and him, and luckily the soldier gives up and wanders away. But the next day, he's out and about, and a drunk Confederate soldier is out roaming around with a knife in his hand, and he ends up ripping the knife out of this guy's hand when he's completely, disoriented, and putting it on his person to defend himself because he's so terrified of being accosted by other Confederates in town. At another instance, a Confederate soldier who's been severely wounded in the head kind of bursts through the door. This is in the middle of the day. He's acting very strange. He's holding his eyeballs open, his eyelids open. He's screaming into the mirror. He's clearly not in his right mind. And Watkins has to take this guy and literally throw him outside. One of them loses his watch to a soldier and has to bargain to try and get it back. So it's this constant interplay of, civilians' interactions with both the enemy and with their own troops. And I should say that not every interaction with the Confederate soldiers is a negative one. There are some civilians who say, oh, they were remarkably helpful or protective, and I never felt threatened. Whereas others would say, these guys were ruffians, they took everything we had, they threatened our lives. But certainly these boys, they have a full range of experiences trying to help and defend, women who are left alone in their houses, trying to nurse various soldiers, Union and Confederate. By the time they are reunited after the battle ends, it's actually a good day, over a day after the battle ends, because they've been told that the Confederates are going to come back and shell the town. So again, this kind of confusion and chaos and not knowing what's real and what's not. So they're hiding out still long after the Confederates have even retreated from town, because they've all these rumors are circulating and they don't know what to believe. When they finally are reunited, they come back to Pennsylvania Hall, which is the big white building on campus. It still stands. It's the main administrative building today. That was the dorm building, the main dorm building for these boys. And Michael Culver finds his room totally occupied by wounded soldiers. There are soldiers lying all in the various dorm rooms, all in the hallways. He talks about the moans and the screaming and just the horrific sights and sounds around him. All of the books and the students' learning equipment had been taken and thrown into the president's house for safety, but a lot of the books had also been retrieved and used as pillows for some of the soldiers. Doesn't sound too comfortable, but I guess any elevation is better than nothing. And in fact, some of those books bearing the blood from the wounds of these soldiers are still in the college's special collections, which is pretty cool to see today. But anyway, so Culver and Watkins, they come back and they find their home away from home completely torn apart and in use as a field hospital. There are about 700 soldiers who are being treated in and around Pennsylvania Hall. And of course, the whole college campus had been part of the battlefield. And you would think, again, the horror, maybe the outrage, especially at their confrontations with Confederates, would lead these boys to just want to run home and get away from this scene. But they don't. They commit themselves for the next several weeks to helping the various wounded, both Union and Confederate, who are in Pennsylvania Hall. What's interesting about these two is that after the war, they both marry. They both eventually move away from the Pennsylvania area, but they both become ministers. And I'm not sure whether this was something that they had always wanted to be, and it was kind of their natural devoted hearts that helped them, share that same caring spirit for enemy and friend alike during the battle. Whether, of course, during the 19th century, it was just the thing you do. You take care of the enemy soldiers, you take care of your own soldiers. Or perhaps whether they had stumbled upon this career, kind of this drive to become ministers after what they had seen and experienced at Gettysburg. The need to show compassion to friend and foe alike, whether that led them to both become ministers shortly after the war. I'm just not sure, but it is kind of interesting that this happened. Now, they were tapped, as were several other students, to write about their experiences during the battle for the yearbook, and they do so in the 1902 version of the yearbook. What's interesting is that Michael Culver doesn't write about the details of the battle. He doesn't write about the details of his own adventures. He doesn't write about the details of the horrible things he's seen. Instead, he only writes about how proud that Penn College students should be, having had this major Union battle, this greatest battle in American history in his mind, fought across their campus. And that this was always going to be something that students of Pennsylvania College, and of course then Gettysburg College, could claim, and that they should stand very proud. He didn't talk necessarily about, people should be proud of me and my sacrifices and my work to helping the wounded. It wasn't that at all. It was that Pennsylvania College would always be deeply rooted and intertwined in this great Union victory, and that those students should always have a deep pride and connection to what had happened there on their campus, which I think, is true for many students today who come to Gettysburg College, certainly the more history and Civil War minded ones, but also students who, maybe aren't super into the Civil War or super into history. That sense of place is certainly there. And, hopefully they carry on Michael Culver's hope that, they have a certain tie, an inescapable, connection and sense of pride to this great historical event that transpired on their campus.
And I think the first year walk goes a long way towards
Yeah.
impressing that on folks, which I had the opportunity to participate in 2013. The first year Gettysburg College students, they they walk through town to the National Cemetery where they have there's a keynote speaker that kind of hits on some of those themes that you were just talking about there, and that Michael Culver spoke about in his article. So yeah, it's certainly a remarkable place, and if folks have the chance to visit the Gettysburg College campus, I certainly would, if you can. And you all have some great little interpretive signs kind of scattered around the campus as well, which are really nice. So that's good. And man, what a remarkable story, and what an experience that those two uh, went through just over the span of a few days. I can only imagine what that reunion would have been like, for them, where the last they saw each other is on July 1st, and then they don't see each other till July 5th. I mean, that kind
Right,
of coming together, just phew, can't even
right,
fathom.
right. Imagine the stories and how similar some of the stories were, but also, different as well. But finally coming back to your college friends and kind of college brothers, after having lived a lifetime in 3 days, would certainly be a chilling experience.
Absolutely. Um, these are just incredible stories, and as always, we only just scratched the surface. There's at least one other one that we hope to get to today, along with four or five others in in reserve, as it were. So we might do this again sometime.
Part
The
three.
the civilian stories are, well, on all Civil War battlefields, but certainly Gettysburg are rich, and there are many of them. And they go, I think, a long way. Like we were saying, that the Civil War, really, it impacts everyone at all layers of society, and certainly Civil War battles impacted the people that lived there, and there's no shortage of stories to be told in that vein. And just the three that we touched on today, I think, are incredibly compelling, really moving, and they have a lot to say about the Civil War era. So thank you so much for sharing those with us, Ashley.
Sure, sure. No, it's always fun. And as much as I love just sharing the stories of what unfolds in the battlefield and the human experiences there, I do think it's so important to remember that the battlefield was someone's home. It was many people's home, here in Gettysburg, and same with any battle that occurs throughout the Civil War. And certainly, we don't have to interpret those stories in silos. The civilian experience is very much intertwined with the military, and vice versa. So, definitely hope that I help to repopulate the battlefield, with some different stories today, and help to give kind of a different perspective on what Gettysburg was like, not only in July of '63, but before and after as well.
Absolutely. Uh, Thanks so much for tuning in and watching this. If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button, hit the share button, tell folks about it, send it to people who you think might enjoy it. Make sure you follow us across all our social medias, both organizations, to stay up to date with all the latest content we're putting out there. And then finally, if you want to take your support to the next level, consider becoming a member of the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. You get free admission to our location here in Frederick, Pry House out in Antietam, the Clara Barton Missing Soldiers Office in DC, and thanks to a reciprocal membership program, the Seminary Ridge Museum in Gettysburg, the site where one of those Penn College
Right.
students spent some time, I believe, right? So there you can they have great exhibits there about the building's use as a field hospital and all that. So for as low as $25 a year, you can get free admission to all of those locations. So
And you would
um,
get 15% off your registration at the CWI conference, June 9th through 14th. So you can never get enough history,
exactly,
here in the greater
exactly.
Gettysburg area.
And those $25 will pay for themselves real quickly. So that'd be great if you haven't already signed up. We'd encourage you to do so. And yeah, that's all we have for you today. Thanks again for tuning in. This is John and Ashley signing off.
Thank you.